the Defence Secretary has defended reports, well, I suppose he would because he's the Defence Secretary, of a plane shortage for the UK's involvement in the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings, following suggestions that just one plane might be available.
Yeah, for the commemorations in June. Grant Shapps, though, says 181 parachuters will take part. That is the same number who jumped in that location during the landings back in 1944. Historian, author, broadcaster Jonathan Dimbleby has written a new book which explores Winston Churchill's fears about the whole D-Day operation and the march of 2 million Russian soldiers in the East, which you say had a really decisive effect on World War II. And, in fact, you call it Endgame.
Yeah. I think the evidence is compelling that while D-Day was very important indeed, that the war effectively was won and lost on the Eastern Front, a story that's not widely told, but is fundamental to what happened as a result of the end of the war, because Stalin had such enormous power as a result of sweeping through, losing huge numbers of Russian lives, reaching Berlin and beyond. And you had in your introduction, this caused Churchill huge anxiety.
Well, I suppose there's a parallel to today, isn't there? I mean, we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine. And what Russia does have is just endless manpower. They are willing, culturally, to throw as many men as it takes at the problem.
The history of Russia is people dying in vast numbers for whoever is running the country.
Right.
Autocracy of one sort or another under the Empire, autocracy under Stalin, and now a form of autocracy under Putin. And they've got the numbers.
Yeah.
In Ukraine, they can throw people into battle. Now, this is modern warfare, so it isn't only fought with men, but they are not, the regime is not worried about losing lives, and they've got many more lives to lose than the Ukrainians have.
What we don't have...
Sorry, you carry on.
What we don't have is numbers of planes. Now, we have the D-Day commemorations taking place, June, Normandy. The plan, apparently, was to send 4 planes and drop these paratroopers from the planes. Apparently, we've only got 1. Now, we hear perhaps we can muster 2, but are we letting our veterans down? Or are we showing that we simply don't have the same military capability that we should have?
Well, we definitely don't. I mean, we were fighting as an empire. The huge numbers of ships that were used in D-Day for the D-Day landings, vast army, relatively vast army, tiny by comparison with the Russian forces, Soviet forces. But it is a much smaller force, whether it's the right size, whether it's, as is committed by this government, going to be built up. I noticed Grant Shapps says 181, the same. He was very careful in what he said, smart fellow. He said it landed at that spot.
Yes.
Of course, there were many more parachutists who went in. My father on D-Day was standing watching and reporting as the planes took off the Pathfinders.
Richard Dimbleby, father.
Yes, Richard Dimbleby, And you know, the Americans were in large numbers, so it's a sleight of hand to say, to imply, if he, I'm sure he didn't intend to, I hope he didn't intend to, you never know with these people,
I think
that was all there were. There were many more than 181 parachuters.
Just coming back to... I found your book fascinating. It's really interesting. Key question. I mean, younger people probably only really know about D-Day because of the film Saving Private Ryan, to be honest with you. But the key question is this. If it hadn't happened, if Churchill had won the argument and we hadn't invaded in 1944, would Germany have been defeated anyway? In other words, did we need D-Day to win the war? We
needed D-Day for 2 reasons: to facilitate victory and to speeden the destruction of Nazi Germany.
But would it have happened anyway?
Well, I don't know. That's speculative, but I think that in due course, Stalin's might... It was actually... He had if you think, when the Germans invaded Russia in 1941 in June, the Russians had 6 million men on the battlefield. Between then and 1944, they lost nearly 8 million men on the battlefield. They still fielded 6 million men in 1944, and they were bound to grind down. They had American largely American but also British support in terms of vehicles and technology and indeed food for hungry Russian people. But the answer is, I think, that D-Day was as important for protecting Western Europe against the possibility of what Stalin might do with any successor regime in Germany.
Got it.
One person who's definitely going to be there, we understand, the King. He's your friend. How relieved is he that he's going to be there? How important is it to the King?
I know how frustrated he was. I mean, one of the first things, of course, a diagnosis of cancer is a shock to any human being. He was no less shocked, I am sure, than anyone else who gets that diagnosis. But immediately he was on to the things that he wanted to do that the doctors at that point were not letting him do, and he was missing doing. And for him, D-Day it's very important for two fundamental reasons. One is he knows it's important in the nation's life, and therefore to be head of state and not to be there when other heads of state are would have been very distressing to him. And secondly, he cares about it himself. He's riveted in our history. He does understand the Second World War and has, you know, a very strong belief that those who did this should be honoured. Yes. So I think he must be very relieved that the doctors said, "All right, boss, you can go."
Jonathan, thank you.
I wonder what Camilla thinks. What was it she said last week? Yes, he's getting better, but only if he behave himself. He's doing so much.
I suspect. I know what she means.
All right.
Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
And you're going to stick around because we're going to talk to you about something completely different in a few minutes' time. But
could Jersey become Britain's answer to dignitas? Politicians on the island are debating changing the law to allow terminally ill adults who've lived in Jersey for 12 months the option to end their lives with medical assistance. And a vote on that is expected later this very week.
So we asked Jonathan Dimbleby to stay with us because you have a personal connection to this story because your brother was diagnosed with motor neurone disease. He's died earlier this year. And you advocate a change to the law on assisted dying. How would that have changed things for your brother, do you think, Jonathan?
I don't know how it would have changed in practice for him. I've always been a supporter of the right to an assisted death. He wanted the option and believed he should have had the option, once he was terminally ill, of sound mind as he was until the very end, but in a terrible physical condition. He wanted the option. Whether he would have taken the option, I do not know. I found out on his behalf about dignitas, which is what he was thinking about at one point, the complexities of that, the awfulness of having to go through the procedures, the cost of it, £15,000 now at least. The fact that your loved ones, if they consciously are seen to be helping you in any way towards that end, are liable to criminal prosecution, is a very series of big hurdles. But I think the fundamental point is, in my own view, that if you are terminally ill and of sound mind, you should have that right. I am acutely aware, as anyone should be, of those who are vulnerable and those who have disabilities. I greatly respect those in those situations, particularly those disability campaigners who fear that this is a slippery slope. I don't think there is any need to have a slippery slope with the legislation that I think should be proposed.
If the law is changed in Jersey, it will come into effect in 2027. Now, one of the eligibility criteria is you must have lived in Jersey for a year. And I wonder if somebody like your brother who was diagnosed and knew that they had a year can you imagine that he might have considered moving to Jersey?
I honestly don't know, but I can imagine that would be the case. I think you cannot generalise. Individuals, when they're stricken with a terminal illness, respond to it in all sorts of ways. So I think one just has to look at it not as whether or not people would seek to go to Jersey or would seek to get citizenship in the Isle of Man, which is also considering this. I think you have to look at what has happened in what I regard as the best cases. Oregon in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, where the strict controls over who has the right to die are in place, and where there is no evidence of misuse. I think I'm right in saying in Oregon, for instance, I think it's a really critical thing, of those who have now for some years had the right under the law to have an assisted death, only 1% of them have actually taken it. It's the feeling of liberation, I think, that's important. You have the choice.
Just very, very briefly, you've said in the past that while taking into account those objections to a change in the law, you think that there's a lot of political cowardice involved here in a refusal to change the law in this country.
It's a tough way of putting it. I think it takes political courage because of the anxieties that there are about misuse, the fears of those who have a strong faith, who believe it is wrong, and people listen to those. I suspect that there will be a private member's bill if there is a new parliament with a new prime minister, and that's already been, Keir Starmer's already indicated that. And I suspect that the feeling of the House will be very different, that there will be a majority, and therefore it will, in due course, become part of a legislative procedure.
Right.
And I profoundly hope so.
And not just an offshore option, which it is at the moment.
Precisely.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. If you're affected by that or any of the issues we've been discussing this morning, you can find advice and support, itv.com/helplines.